Hello, everyone. I'm Drew Goldfarb, joined by Taylor Smith. We are giving you an updated look at the odds to win the NBA championship in the 2020 NBA season because since our last video, there have been quite a few moves made, a lot of them coming from the Staples Center, and unlike the previous one where a lot of moves have been made out of the Staples Center with Anthony Davis going to the Lakers, this is their partners that are in there. One of the other two organizations playing out of LA's Staples Center, and that would be the Los Angeles Clippers, a team that has now jumped up to being the betting favorites to win the NBA championship in 2020. They're at plus 270 odds. Taylor, with the additions of Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, and others, is that a warranted number now, or is this again just kind of the recency bias?
I think it actually is warranted, whereas we were skeptical of the Lakers when they made their move. The Clippers just have more depth than the Lakers do. The Lakers have started to fill things out with guys like Cousins and all that, but the Clippers also retained Patrick Beverley. Today they re-signed JaMychal Green. Lou Williams is still there. Montrezl Harrell's still there. That's two of the top three vote getters for Sixth Man of the Year. They kept Ivica Zubac. They added Rodney McGruder late last season. It's just a well-rounded team around two superstars, arguably two of the top 6 or 7 players in the game. Doc Rivers obviously proved last year he could coach any kind of team. So I get why they're favored. The league is more even-keeled now. Like there's no clear favorite like we've had the last 5 years or so. So I get it. Maybe part of it's recency bias with it just happening, but I think it's worthwhile. I think they're a worthy favorite.
I agree with you that they are a worthy favorite, but when you were saying about the depth and kind of it's not the Warriors versus the world as it had been in recent years. And I don't think that the Clippers or the Lakers or the Bucks, who are the 3 favorited teams as of right now, have that. And so to get this plus 270, I think it's still a little narrow when you do have so much competition. There's a variety of competition, especially in the Western Conference. That I don't know if they should be quite such short odds at this point to win the NBA Finals. I mean, when you divide that by 2 to win the West, you're looking at like plus 140 to win the Western Conference, and that just seems crazy to me. But yes, I agree with the Clippers because they didn't really lose anything. They were a playoff team, albeit barely. They did beat Golden State a couple of times in the first round. And they've added a couple of players who should be very, very big additions to that organization, to that team. So if you just added Kawhi Leonard, yeah, sure, they'd be probably a mid-seed as opposed to being an 8 seed last year. If you add just Paul George, maybe around the same thing. When you add both, they would have to be near the top. And I do agree that favoriting them makes sense. I don't think it's just a recency bias. I think that the plus 270 number is a bit of recency bias where there's probably a flurry of betting going to drive that number. But yeah, they should be the favorites as of right now, given what they've added and given the fact that unlike the Lakers, they were a playoff team a year ago. They've added pieces that are comparable to the Lakers at this point, and the Clippers started from a playoff position last year.
And they didn't have to gut their roster as much as the Lakers did to get AD, and they gutted their roster even more to try to get Kawhi. That didn't work out. They're filling it in now, but I agree. I mean, the Clippers should be the favorite, but I agree that plus 270 is not that favorable. I'd prefer it around plus 400 or plus 500. I don't think there should be a team, considering all the question marks with everybody, that should be plus 270 or in that neighborhood. It just opens up all sorts of value with other lower level Western Conference teams, and Kawhi moving west opens up the East even more. So who do you like as like a value atop the East? You have Milwaukee as the obvious favorite. Philadelphia is right there behind them, but then after that, it's like a total crapshoot.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy when you're looking at the Eastern Conference because the Bucks basically stood pat for the offseason, and they do have the reigning MVP, so that's a good place to be. If you're going to be a team standing pat, that's fine. I don't, as far as value goes, they're plus 500, and like you were saying, if that was the Clippers, I would go, okay, that's decent value. But for the Bucks, I don't really know winning the NBA championship. Philly was a team that I liked a year ago, for last season, and they've basically, even though they've replaced a couple of names, they're in a very similar spot. Plus 850 is fine. My value play, though, I think it's the obvious one, but it's Brooklyn at plus 2,000. The Nets were, again, a borderline playoff team, but a playoff team. The Eastern Conference, that means something very different than in the West. So they were still basically a 500 team. But they were in the playoffs. They're in the weaker conference. Toronto's taking a step back. You would have to imagine losing Kawhi Leonard. But when you look at the players that Brooklyn added, Kyrie Irving, Kevin Durant, DeAndre Jordan, Irving will help them. And basically, if they qualify for the playoffs and Durant's healthy for the second round, they're going to be a very good team, assuming that he's healthy for the second round. That's kind of the key, is that if Durant isn't Kevin Durant in the playoffs, whenever he can come back, the Nets I'd prefer Philly. But as far as you're getting better than double the odds, better than double the payout on a Brooklyn take, that for me gives them some value. I know that Boston added Kemba Walker, but they lost quite a few or two big pieces. So I'm not overly bullish on the Celtics. I would say the Nets or the Sixers would be the play. I would lean towards the Nets because I think there's more upside. I think that the Nets are in a position where if Durant can come back and if Durant can get into being Kevin Durant by the second round of the playoffs, they're going to be the team to beat in the Eastern Conference.
Yeah, and that's something we talked about last time, how everyone's kind of assuming he's done for the whole year, and maybe he will be, but we don't know that. Different guys take different timelines when it comes to an Achilles, so he could be gone all of next year. He could be gone until, March, April, playoffs, something like that. I don't know how they're going to play it. Obviously, it's a long-term investment for them, so they obviously don't want to rush him back, but I like that. I like that at plus 2,000, I think you said. Yep. Same odds I'm seeing as Boston. One team in the East, I don't think it's a worthwhile title pick, but I think as far as possibly winning the Eastern Conference, I think Indiana at plus 1,200 is a little interesting, just because, like you said, Toronto's probably dropping off. They'll still be there, but they're not even close to the team they were last year without Kawhi. Indiana was up there in the top tier of the Eastern Conference before Oladipo went down for the year with that quad. They've added Malcolm Brogdon. They added Jeremy Lamb, who I think was a nice value contract, and then they added someone else, but I can't remember right now. Anyway, they were up there with those other teams for a while. Yeah, T.J. Warren for nothing. They traded nothing to Phoenix to get that guy. So they lost Bogdanovich, and Darren Collison abruptly retired, but I think they upgraded those positions. So as far as winning the Eastern Conference, I don't think the Pacers are a horrible long shot, but I don't think they really have a title chance.
I would agree with you. I mean, the good side, or the good thing too, is that I think there are about 4 or 5 teams in the East that have a legitimate shot as of right now. I mean, we're still, a couple months away from them playing a game, but that are legitimate options for winning the Eastern Conference, and they'll provide some decent enough odds too. Milwaukee, I mean, are the Bucks still, in your mind, a favorite? They lost Malcolm Brogdon, but they still have Antetokounmpo. They're still the best team in the NBA from a year ago. They're down one piece. The rest of the conference has shifted around them, and that's always been my thing when you're looking at a team, is that a team that stays the same gets worse because every team around them is going to get better. So are the Bucks still? They are the betting favorites for the Eastern Conference at plus 500 is what I'm seeing. Are they still a legitimate favorite, or are they now kind of one of the pack when you're looking at that? If you're even forgetting the odds that have been placed on them, if you're looking at it from a pure picking perspective, are they one of a few that could win, or are they still a favorite?
I don't see them as much of a favorite anymore, but to be fair, you could argue that Toronto lost something. Philadelphia lost Jimmy Butler. They kind of replaced him with Al Horford. It's hard to see how that works. They kind of have a double center thing going on there. But I don't see Milwaukee as a clear-cut favorite, but I don't really see anyone else as a clear-cut favorite. But as we've kind of been hinting at, I think Philly is the team that makes the most sense from a value bet. They did lose J.J. Redick as well, but Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid are still young players that could get better. Tobias Harris, they kept. I think it was good of them to get Josh Richardson back in that trade for Jimmy Butler. So I don't think they're as wounded as a team like Toronto, obviously. I'm just less sold on the Bucks. Like, they kind of captured lightning in a bottle with that first year under Mike Budenholzer. Giannis, they built the team perfectly around Giannis with shooting. But the question for me is whether Bledsoe can hold up in the playoffs as their lead guard. We saw him, kind of wax and wane as the playoffs went on. And once Brogdon came back, it kind of stabilized a little bit. But I think losing him is a big deal. I don't necessarily think they should have retained him on the dollar amount that he got from Indiana. But I see why Milwaukee's the favorite. I think they will finish. They're a lock for a top 2 seed, but I don't really love the value of plus 500 to win the title. I'm just not. I don't know. Like you said, teams around them got better, and they arguably got worse.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, is that when you're looking at a conference where there's a few teams that could realistically come out of the East, the reason the Bucks are probably the betting favorites is because they're the known value. They're the ones that you go, oh, this was kind of like the team in 2018-19. So you can look at that and go, there would be a reasonable opportunity for them to finish, like you said, in the top 2 in the conference. And if you do that, you're playing at a 7 or an 8 seed. So you're playing a team with a losing record or a 500 record in the East. So you're on to the second round. And it's one of those things, I think, that it's kind of they're almost a default favorite because they're the ones with the fewest unknown quantities on the team. Philadelphia replacing a couple of players on their team, but like you said, they've got 2 fantastic players on that roster. Let's jump back to the West, because Golden State is somehow still plus 1,000 to win the NBA championship. And this is having lost DeMarcus Cousins and Kevin Durant, and Klay Thompson is out for a considerable amount of time. At the very least, considerable amount of time is probably putting it mildly. They're ahead of teams like Houston, Utah, that made a couple of moves, 2 big acquisitions for the Jazz. That's the 3 teams that I'm seeing that are in that plus 1,000 to 1,500 range. Denver is the next one in the West that I'm seeing at plus 2,000. Is Golden State, because they're the ones who have the shortest odds, plus 1,000, the Rockets at plus 1,100, the Jazz at plus 1,500. I look at those 3 teams, and I'd put Golden State as being third out of that group. And they're here at 1,000. They're behind only the Los Angeles teams. Am I crazy for thinking that Golden State is dramatically overpriced in this, that they should be closer to that? I don't know. I'm looking at they should be almost like what the Raptors are, plus 2,500, maybe plus 2,000, because they still have Steph and Curry. And they're going to get Klay Thompson back maybe at some point.
Yeah, they're way overvalued. I think it's just respect for what they've done over the last few years. I guess they're kind of afraid to lower their odds too much, just because they have been so dominant for the most part. But, all those guys they lost, plus they lost Andre Iguodala as well. Quinn Cook, you can argue his impact. But their big acquisition is D'Angelo Russell, which I don't understand at all, since they also retained Klay on that long-term deal and they have Curry. So I don't know what they're doing. They're just going to roll 3 guards out there, I guess, once Klay comes back. Keeping Looney was nice, but I don't know if this team's even going to make the playoffs, just because Thompson may miss the whole season. We don't know. I mean, he tore his ACL like as late as you possibly can. So I have no idea whether he's coming back next season. But the West is just so deep. I would put all those teams you named ahead of them. Denver, Utah, and Houston. I would definitely bet on all those teams before I bet on Golden State, just because I don't think Russell is the impact player that some think he may be. He's a nice player, but I don't think he's a $120 million guy, especially when you already have Curry. It's just kind of redundant to me. They're kind of taking the Rockets model with the double guard thing. I'm not sure how it's going to work for them, but I don't know. I just don't see it. I mean, I think they'll make the playoffs. I think they'll get probably a 6 to an 8 seed. But they're playing in the Pacific, which is the 2 LA teams, plus the Kings appear to have improved. Phoenix is still garbage. But I don't know. I just don't really see a path to them winning the title at all next season. The West is too loaded and they're too wounded. They were already vulnerable before they got Kevin Durant. He kind of lifted them over the top the last couple of years. We've seen Curry struggle in the playoffs. He was not that great in these most recent playoffs. So he's going to have to carry an added load. I just don't see it with them at all. I think their window is probably shut.
There are 2 other Western Conference teams, by the way, that missed the playoffs or there's 2 other teams I'm looking at anyway, that missed the playoffs that have made some at least decent enough acquisitions that their betting odds are better than those for like San Antonio, Oklahoma City, and then Orlando and Detroit, but we're not going to get into those because they were playoff teams. But anyway, Oklahoma City lost Paul George, Jeremy Grant, and they're probably going to trade Russell Westbrook at some point. So Moving away from the Thunder, the Dallas Mavericks are plus 4,500. They added Porzingis. They added him. He missed a year. So he is going to be back. The New Orleans Pelicans, plus 5,500, are kind of interesting. I don't know if I'm not taking them to win the NBA championship, but there's got to be down there further the ability to bet on whether or not they would make the postseason, something to that extent as far as a prop bet would go. Plus 5,500 odds to win the NBA championship. That basically amounts to, I'm not looking at to win their conference, but should be about 2,700-ish to win the conference. They've added Zion Williamson, although he got hurt in his first Summer League game. They added Lonzo Ball as well. Thoughts on Lonzo Ball are going to vary from person to person. Are the Pelicans a potential playoff team this year, or is it way too early, way too soon, and way too unproven? Because they've added a couple of pieces, obviously, this offseason, but a little bit of an unproven quantity with basically everything they've added. They do look like they're in line for something at some point. Because they're one of those teams that right now they're like, ooh, there's going to be a year. There's going to be a year where the Pelicans become that team.
Yeah, so it's just a numbers game. Like if they were in the East, I would say they're a lock just because of their depth, but in the West, it's just such a bloodbath. If you can get them on odds, favorable odds to make the playoffs, I think it's a decent bet just because, like you said, Oklahoma City, I think they're probably going to fall out. Golden State's not a lock to make the playoffs. San Antonio was on the fringe last year. I'm not sure how much better they've gotten, maybe a little bit better. But, the Lakers are going to come up and take a spot, assuming they don't have an injury catastrophe or something like that. Sacramento's better. New Orleans, Dallas. Dallas is probably better. I don't really like Dallas's depth at all. Once you get past Luka and Porzingis, it's pretty questionable. So I don't think they're going to make it this year. But I think New Orleans, as a to make the playoffs bet, is pretty interesting. Getting Redick was huge for them because, they didn't really have any shooting on the roster before that. Lonzo can't shoot. Ingram's questionable. Zion, we don't know. Jahlil Okafor is still there. So getting JJ Redick, I think, was a big step forward in the right direction for them, even if he's just kind of a fringy player. I do think they're interesting, though. And among those fringy playoff teams, I think New Orleans and Sacramento are probably the best values just to make the playoffs. Obviously, neither of them is coming close to winning the title. But, like the bottom half of the West is just such a crapshoot right now. You know who's going to make it at the top, injuries permitting. Denver, Portland, Houston, Utah, both LA teams. That's 6 right there. So beyond that, I think you're getting into decent value bets. Oklahoma City, I think, is the main team that takes a hit, though, obviously.
Yeah, and depending on where Russell Westbrook goes, if he were to go to a team that's kind of not one of the 6 that you named, I don't know if they would keep him in the West, but who knows? If they did trade him within the West and it was to one of those teams that's not one of the 6, that would probably at least get a team a lot closer to locking up the 7th spot. The one team we haven't really gotten into in depth yet on the top is the Lakers. We talked about them in our last video, but they are now the second highest odds. Right after the trade was completed, there were some places, because I saw ESPN citing that they were basically almost they were less than a 2-1 favorite to win the NBA championship, which was insane. There was something like plus 150 in July to win the NBA championship next May or June. A team that missed the playoffs last year, which we do still have to say, despite all of the acquisitions, just remember this was not a playoff team before adding Anthony Davis, DeMarcus Cousins, Danny Green, Rajon Rondo. They've added a lot of pieces. How long into the season do you think it will take to see these players come together at that point? Because, it could be an instantaneous thing when you're talking about LeBron James and Anthony Davis, and if they do that, then they're good. But you're talking about a dramatic overhaul of the roster aside from James. How long does that take for this team to settle in? And is it possible that they may not 100% gel by even late in the year? Because I do think that they've got to be locked in together at some point. But you kind of never know when you're picking up 4 players that weren't on the roster last year and you're expecting all of them to contribute.
Yeah, we saw, remember the first year of the Heat after they got LeBron and Bosh, they didn't really gel at all at first. There were rumors about firing Spoelstra, and LeBron like bumped into him and all that stuff, and people were all reading the tea leaves and everything. I think it's a question mark for both LA teams, though. The Clippers do have more continuity down the roster, but what matters is the stars, and those guys have never played together. So I think it's a fair question for both of those teams, and that obviously matters when it comes to the playoffs because, if either of them struggles out the gates and they wind up as a 4 or 5 as a result, then that matters. And having home court, we've seen, is something that comes into play once you get into the postseason. Toronto having it in the finals helped a lot. So I think it'll take a while. LeBron, we saw last year, they kind of got off to a middling start once he joined the fray. This team's better, obviously. Anthony Davis is probably better than anyone he's ever played with. So they will be fine. They're going to make the playoffs, both of those teams, but it's a fair question. And I think it kind of calls back into play a team like the Rockets, who's pretty much going to be the same team that we saw last season, it appears, unless they are a random Westbrook suitor. But seeing Houston at plus 900 to win the conference, plus 1,400. I don't know if you have different odds to win the title. A team like that's interesting. 2 years ago, they were the best team in the West. I think they had the best record in the NBA. Struggled a little bit last season, but they were still, they were the primary threat among Western Conference teams to Golden State in the end. So with Golden State having been knocked down several pegs and question marks with other teams at the top, whether Houston with the same team coming back can take advantage of that remains to be seen, but I like their chances. I think they're a decent kind of mid-tier value.
Yeah, the Jazz are kind of similar for me because of the acquisition to like Mike Conley. But going back on the Los Angeles teams, the really good point there that you made was that a slow start could mean that they end up in the 3 or 4 seed range. And if you do that and you end up with a first round matchup of Houston or Utah or Denver, you're in a much different boat for a playoff run than you are if you're the 1 seed or the 2 seed and you're locking into a first round matchup against New Orleans. That could be a dramatic shift. It really is going to be key, especially playing in the Western Conference, for both LA teams to kind of lock in early so that they don't end up trying to come from behind and work their way up the standings as the season progresses, because I could see that being the undoing at least for one of those two. Because if they don't gel and they don't mesh and they end up as a 4 seed or a 3 seed even, and you're playing one of those 6 teams that we are pretty confident are locked into playoff spots in the West in the first round, you could end up in trouble. Because then you're also going to play one of the other, instead of playing the 4 seed, you're going to play the 2 seed. That could be trouble.
It's also worth noting the Lakers are the only team among these with a new coach. The players on the Clippers have been around for a while and know what Doc Rivers is all about. Houston with D'Antoni, Portland with Stotts, Utah, Quinn Snyder, all that. The Lakers are a pretty much blank palette. We don't know what to expect here. They have, they brought back Rondo. They have Kuzma, LeBron, JaVale McGee. But, throwing a new coach into things adds a new wrinkle. There's more to learn there. There's more of a learning curve. And that's another thing that could kind of hinder them out of the gates, I think.
So wrapping everything up, if you're taking a team from each conference to win, whether you're looking for value or you just think it's the most likely to pay off, which teams are you taking as we're sitting here like a week into July, a couple days after free agency officially actually opened for the NBA? What are your value plays or your picks for the 2020 NBA Finals?
I think the clear value out east is Philly for all the reasons we talked about. As we've said before, they were just a few bounces from bouncing the Raptors in the conference semis. So that's a decent team I think is coming back. I think they might be a little better. So Philly in the East, Houston and Utah. We haven't talked about Utah a ton. You touched on them a little bit, but that's a team that is way better, I think. Mike Conley is a perfect complement for Donovan Mitchell in the backcourt. They've added shooting with Bojan Bogdanovic. Ed Davis is a nice front court piece to put next to Rudy Gobert. So Utah and Denver, that one tier with Utah, Houston, and Denver, I think is teeming with value. I think you can take any of those teams. We talked about Denver last time, how that's another kind of continuity project there. So all three of those are great values. If I had to pick one, I'd say Houston, just because they've had the most playoff success of those teams lately. But I think the West is so stacked. I think you can make an argument for 7 teams to possibly get out of the conference, depending on how things shake out. So East is thin at the top. So Milwaukee or Philly, maybe Indiana for me. The West is just a bloodbath. So if you're going to bet on this, I think I would go with the East, just because it's more clear at this time.
I agree with both of your assessments on it. I like you. I'm big on the Sixers. I think that they did a good job of replacing the pieces they lost, essentially. We'll see how they fit in and that sort of thing. I do think that Milwaukee is, I mean, they were vulnerable last year because they lost to Toronto. So they are still vulnerable because they're basically the same team. If I'm looking for just pure value, I kind of like looking a little further down in the numbers on it. Brooklyn, I think, is an interesting play to win the East. If you could basically get plus 1,000 odds on them to win the conference, they're kind of an interesting one. I would still lean towards Philadelphia, but I wouldn't hate picking the Nets if you are confident in them getting healthy. That's kind of the play on it, because once there's a definitive timeline on Durant's health, that number is going to change dramatically, and they're either going to be not worth the wager at all because they're going to be way down because he's not coming back, or the number is going to shoot up dramatically because he is coming back. So I kind of like them as that kind of a play at this point. In the West, the 3 teams that you named, I agree with. I might lean a little towards the Jazz as far as the Houston and Utah combination. Denver, I'm seeing a plus 2,000 to win the NBA Finals from my bookie. Denver is a pretty consistent team, looking pretty consistent from last year. They were the best team at home in the NBA. If both LA teams start off a little bit sluggish and the Nuggets can end up shooting towards the top of the conference, a 1 or a 2, they might be the team to play. They might be the team to beat in the Western Conference. So if I'm looking for pure value, I'm going Brooklyn and Denver, hoping that one of those pays off to win their conference. If I'm looking with a more realistic value, I'm probably just agreeing with you and going with Philadelphia and either Houston or Utah. I don't know if I have the faith in the Rockets to be able to advance to the NBA Finals that you do. So I might lean a little bit towards Utah. They're a bit more of an unknown. You get a little bit more value on them. But that's kind of what I would do. If you're looking for a bit safer, for me, Philadelphia and your choice of Houston or Utah. If you're looking for hoping to get value out of one of the 2, Brooklyn and Denver for me are the 2 that I would be playing at this point. But let us know who you think is the best value play or just the best pick to win the 2020 NBA Finals as we're sitting here in July. Let us know in the comments below. He's Taylor Smith. I'm Drew Goldfarb. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Odds On Favorites YouTube channel, and we'll see you next time.